delays. Right, so what we're going to talk about today is syllogistic forms. Of course, everybody's excited about that. You come here for nothing else. Came to graduate school to talk about syllogisms, how the syllogism is rational and rational is the actual, all that kind of stuff, right? So you know that. But I'm going to try to make the case here in just a minute for the significance of the syllogistic forms, and then we'll look at them all, but we'll focus in on the disjunctive syllogistic form for reasons that will be obvious in just a little bit. Our goal today is really to try to do two things. If we get one of them done, I'll be happy. If we get the other one done, fantastic. I imagine we won't. We'll have to delay that one until next session, next class session, so we'll do it next week. But two things is we want to make sense of what's going on with syllogisms in general. Why the syllogisms follow from judgment, right? What's going on there? What's their significance? What are they trying to lay out? What they're trying to say by going through them all? And then the hardest thing, right, in the chapter in a lot of ways comes right at the end, as always. Transition from subjectivity into objectivity. And Hegel's claim, I'll just state it as brutally, so you don't think you missed it, you didn't. Hegel's claim there is that syllogisms necessarily of themselves entail objectivity. Syllogisms necessarily, disjunctive syllogisms in particular, but syllogisms of themselves, the syllogistic form, necessarily entails objectivity. So objectivity is not something that's setting out beyond syllogisms that we apply syllogisms to. Syllogisms of themselves, right, if you just work through their syllogistic forms, actually overcomes that distinction between the formalism that characterizes all subjectivity, right? All the count of subjectivity, concept, judgment, and syllogism are all about this formal side of this process. So it's the rule governedness of the process that generates all things, but it's not itself that process. It's the account of the rules. And at that last moment, right, Hegel wants to tries to show that syllogistic form itself entails its own objectivity, that it doesn't separate itself. It's not a form of something. It just is that thing itself. And that's what he means by objectivity. So, and that's the transition into objectivity, which we'll start talking about, of course, next week. But I think, as I've said several times before, is Hegel saying, now let's go back to being an essence. We won't do it explicitly because we're not going to match them up, right? Quality, quantity, measure, all those sorts of things. We're not going to go back and do a kind of chart of some kind or another that would directly link them up. I might do one in class, but doesn't do it in the text. But let's go back to the discussions that we had in Being and Essence, which is all about objectivity, right? All about the nature of reality. And let's see how this process that we've been articulating through concept, judgment, and syllogism, how that actually looks when it's generating objectivity itself, when it's generating reality itself. And that's what mechanism, chemism, and teleology are really all about, right? And yeah, so more about that when we get there. So that, in my view, is a kind of incredibly important but incredibly dense section of the text, because what Hegel's in essence trying to do there is give us, if you buy into the account I've been trying to proffer in the class, which is that the objective logic is a relational ontology and the subjective logic is a process on logic. Then what's going on in the objectivity chapter is an unfolding of what that process looks like as generating those generating all the related relations that we looked at in quality, quantity, measure, and so forth. Right? So that's coming, attraction, that's coming up next week. We'll start looking at that. The other thing to note about that when you read that for next week, how have I got that broken up? Yeah, I have you reading just the mechanism and chemism chapters of objectivity for next week, because that's enough, frankly. That chemism chapter is a bitch. Right? I'll just tell you right now, you'll get lost in mechanism, but at least you kind of go back and go, I think it's kind of going like this. But in the chemism chapter, you'll go, because I'll just warn you about this as always, right? Mechanism is not mechanical, right? Mechanism is not mechanical. So don't go in there and start thinking, oh, Newtonian mechanics are going to be at work now. Find it nowhere, right? Go in there looking for what he does and see what he does and let that define what mechanism is for him. And then this mysterious thing called chemism, which who the hell knows what that is? Nobody talks about chemism. Will start to make a little more sense, at least in terms of what it's supposed to do. What's really difficult about it is things like it's got a catalyst that shows up there that strikes things and makes them turn differently. And then he ends by talking about as he would, given what he's going to do today, 3 different syllogisms that define what's going on in chemism. Right? So it's all kind of craziness, but it gets you towards the teleology chapter, which I'll just remind you, right? The teleology chapter is not an account of final causality. The teleology chapter is not where you go and say, Aristotle. Right? Now we finally get Hegel's Aristotelianism. The teleology chapter is an account of external or extrinsic teleology. Instrumentality, how one thing is used by another. In this case, how objectivity is used by the concept. That's the relationship we're talking about. The idea of teleology that we're more familiar with will get taken up in the first chapter of the idea section, which is about life. All right. That's a little rant about where we're headed. Let's talk about where we've been. Questions, issues, things you want to come back to right off the bat? All right. So what I thought would be useful for a moment is just to remind ourselves, why are we talking about concept judgment and syllogism? And then I'll review what we did with judgments last time, and that'll prepare our way to go into syllogisms. So let's talk about concept and judgment. I'm going to look at page 550 is where I'm at. This is page 53 in the German 550. First paragraph on page 550. So, typically this is one of those passages you can kind of go back to, and this is where Hegel's, here's what I think I've shown thus far, here's where we're headed. That's a reliable passage to use for that. First paragraph down on 550, page 53 in the German. First paragraph begins, judgment is the determinateness of the concept posited in the concept itself. Go sure I'm at? Right there, first line. So he says, judgment is the determinateness of the concept posited in the concept itself. Now, focus on that word positive for just a moment, because you'll say, well, we've been talking about the determinations of the concept. That's what the concept chapter was about, my friend, right? So, what's significant about judgment over against that? Well, remember, as we're about to rehearse, what we saw in the concept discussion is that universality just is particularization. And then when it particularizes itself fully and completely, when it's a genuine necessary totality, right? When that principle of particularization has issued forth in a totality, then the universality just is that particularization, and that's what it means for it to be singular individual. So those moments flow into one another. They're not relata. That's not a relation between determinations. That's just universality just is particularization, just is individuality. They're all defining of one another. They all mean the same thing, right? That's a simple way of putting it for Hegel. But what we saw at the end of that, and I'll recall this in just a moment, right, is in the singular, is that you get the completion of that process, right? It returns into itself, that's that moment. But you also get its loss. And the loss of it means that those 3 moments, universality, particularity, and singularity, can be held distinct from one another. Now that distinctness from one another is what he's referring to here as posited in the concept. It's the judgment, Urteil, right? Is the determinants of the concept. It's the 3 moments, universality, particularity, singularity, individuality. This now posited in the concept itself. Now we can see it there because of the loss, not the coming back to itself, not the return to itself, but the loss of the concept that happens in the moment of singularity. He then says, the determinations of the concept, that's universality, particularity, singularity, that's what he's talking about, have already been considered on their own. That's where we've been in the concept chapter. But this consideration was more a subjective reflection or subjective abstractions, and we've been talking about them without them really being set out in relationship to one another as they are related to one another, how that actually operates. But the concept is itself this abstracting. Remember, this isn't just something we do. It's something that the loss of the concept just is that it gives you this universal, this particular, this individual. So, or a subjective abstraction, but the concept is itself this abstracting. The positioning of its determinations over against each other, there's universal in relationship to particular, in relationship to singularity, is its own determining. It's not our doing. We do it, right? We focus and fixate on it. As a result of this, we can do that. But we're not the ones that break the concept into universality, particularity, individuality. That's the concept of that itself. In coming into its own, it also loses itself. It's the unity, the integrity, the flowing of one into another is lost in these three moments being distinct. Then he says, judgment is this positing of the determinate concepts through, German is durch, so by the concept itself. So I take that to all be Hegel's way of saying, you might think that, as we characterized it last time, that this is an epistemological problem. It's not. That the relating of of universality, particularity, and singularity is something we do when the concept's, flowing away out there, and we stop it and go, no. We're going to need these three moments, and we're going to see how they're related. We're going to make judgments about. So judgment is a subjective, this is what you might think about it, epistemic issue. And Hegel is saying it can be that, but it's never only that. It's an ontological process that happens by virtue of the concept itself. So he says this again, just so you're reminded of this on 557. He comes back to that line. Again, it seems to be one of his main points. This is 557, 3 lines up from the bottom. He's talking about the first kind of judgment. Yeah, 557, 3 lines up from the bottom. This is page 60 in the German. He says there that judgment is the determining of the concept durch again by itself. The concept does this, not predication out of a judge's ascription or assertion about the nature of reality. This is something that the concept does to itself. So let's go back and recall that moment again where this happens, right? Where this moment of the completion but also the loss really is discussed, which is at the end of the concept chapter, which is this notion of singularity again. So we'll come back and remind us of that. And then that leads us obviously into the discussion of Urteil, the originary separation, as he does the false etymology, gets that from Hölderlin. And that takes you into Urteil, which is judgment, and then into syllogism. We'll see how that gets into syllogism. So the final determination of the concept, is singularity, individuality, I'll use those interchangeably as I said repeatedly, is at once the self-relation and the loss of the concept. Both those simultaneously. It's not one and then, oh crap, it all falls apart. His claim is that simultaneously, it's both of those at once. It's both the completion, self-relation, but it's also the loss, the distinguishing those three moments. So talk about the self-relation for just a moment, the completion of it. So singularity as the self-relation. As the self-relation of the concept, the individual or singular is the totality of the concept in the determinations, the moments of the concept, and where they achieve their completion. The singular is universality, fully, completely particularized. Singular just is universality. It's not distinct from universality. It is universality. And it's universality fully, completely particularized. That's what makes it individual. So the determinations of the concept are in the singular, in this sense of the singular, in the self-relation moment of the singular, fundamentally and explicitly bound together in a unity or identity. He calls it this on 546 to 548, 49 to 51 in the German. So that's the moment of completion, as we said last time. But simultaneously with that moment is also the moment of their loss. As the loss of so the singular is both the completion of the concept, but it's also the loss of the concept. As the loss of the concept, the singular is a relation between the self-subsistent fundamental conceptual concept determinations, universality, particularity, singularity, which are here in the product of the process, fixed and unchangeable and independent upon one another. They don't need one another. They can stand alone. So you can talk about universality, but it'll be a this universal because it's not particularized. You can talk about particularity, but it'll be a this particular because it will be distinct from universality and individuality. Similarly, you can talk about this individual, but it's distinct from particularity and universality. So the self-subsistence, which is an ontological claim again, right? That's not an epistemological mistake we make. We can go on to make that mistake and say, that's all there is to the concept, right? It's just these distinct, rigidified, fixed upon determination. But Hegel's always, as we've said before, with Spurious Infinity and other things as well, he's saying these things have ontological roots. That's just not the full truth of them. But they have ontological roots. So when the understanding, Hegel is a well-known critic of the understanding and its attachment to fixities, right? It loves these dichotomies that it can't resolve, right? So it gets fixed on those. How are we going to deal with form and matter? How are we going to deal with thing and property? All these kinds of distinctions. Here, the distinction between universality, particularity, and singularity. He gets and says, oh, those things are distinct from one another. We can do that because there's an ontological rootedness to them. They are distinguishable from them. It's not false. It's not the ultimate truth of them, but it's also not false. So the self-subsistence of each of the determinations of the concept is their abstraction, or better, their abstractability. So this is what Hegel calls the understanding, but also just broadly for Stellung representation. This is what it does. It takes things out of the flow and fixes on them separately because they're abstractable, but they're abstractable because ontologically they're abstract. And it is marked by the specific particular that stands against the universal, the immediate singular, the this, and the abstract universal that stands over against the specific particular, and the relation between the immediate singulars as particulars themselves. So judgment is nothing other than the positing of that structure, the positing of the loss of the oneness of universality just as particularity just is individuality. Here we have universality in relation to particularity, in relation to individuality, and they seem, at least initially, to be self-subsistent fixed moments unto themselves. So judgment, what is it? Well, that's what the copula is, right? The copula brings them together, as we talked about last time. It's what joins the subject to the predicate. So predication, let me use that term for all the various judgment forms. What predication is undergoing or doing, better said, in each one of those judgment forms is it's uniting the moments of the concept back together. And Hegel says quite emphatically that if you want to understand what's going on with all the judgment forms, with all the details of them, yes, but ultimately what's overarching issue, overarching through the, or leading it throughout all of them, if you want to understand that, then what you need to look at is this moment of initially the first judgment form does what? It binds the singular to the universal through the particular. That's what it is. But that bond that the copula creates in the judgments of existence is an extrinsic bond. It holds them together, but it doesn't give any significance of why they're being held together, other than it's just asserted as such. They are bound together. This is that, right? S is P. That's all it is. And by the end of it, by the end of the judgment forms, we move from the judgment of existence to the judgment of necessity, the judgment of concept. By the end of them, what have you seen? You've seen that they all ultimately entail that predication is not extrinsic predication, but it's intrinsic predication. To be universal is necessarily to be defined, particularized, and to be particularized is to be individual. Well, you'll say, didn't I already know that? Wasn't that already true in the concept chapter? Absolutely was. But now the three moments have been distinguished and shown how they entail one another. So the judgment forms are, as he says at the beginning, the positiveness of those determinations, rendering them explicit and then showing how, even in this distinctive form, even in this fixed, rigidified, abstractable form, they do still entail one another of necessity. So we could say then, if we just want to know, how is Hegel thinking about judgment? Judgment for him is thus nothing other than a relation of the fundamental determinations of the concept. So the judgment forms aren't really, like the syllogism forms aren't really either, about how we think and how we make assertions. Of course, it is about that. They are the rules of thinking. They are the rules of judging. Yes. Hegel never backs off on that claim. He thinks that these are that. But they're not just that. That's his existence, is that they're also the nature of the movement of the concept itself. So judgment is thus nothing other than a relation of the fundamental determinations of the concept, where the existence of these determinations is no longer dependent on a process of emergence, as it was in the concept, but rather in the relation between two determinations as particulars. In particular, we're looking at the universal and the singular. So as judgment is the truth of the concept, syllogism is the truth of judgment. That's the way it works. The task of the analysis of judgment is therefore to explain how the fixed, abstractable relation between universality, particularity, and singularity engenders the dynamic movement of the determinations set forth in the analysis of the concept. How do we see now, once we've set out these three moments, why do they actually entail one another in the way that we saw them entailing one another already in the concept chapter? But in the concept chapter, there was no real distinctness between universality, particularity, or individuality. They were all the same damn thing. Different names for the same damn thing. Here, they're different. They're distinct from one another. They're brought into relation through the copula, but that's not all it's going to be. It's not just an extrinsic bond. So as he says on 550, so back up to 550 again. This is the last sentence of the second paragraph down. The paragraph begins, judging is therefore another function than conceiving. or whether it is the other function of the concept, or determining the concept through itself, right? There's that line, constantly determined. So look at the last sentence there. What kind of determinate concepts there are, which ones are given, which ones exist, and how they prove to be necessary determinations of it, that's what has to be exhibited. This has to be exhibited in judgment. This has to be shown in judgment. So what they are, what these moments are. So as we saw last time, how can we think universality? What are the other determinations here? If universality is abstractable, how can you think of it? Well, as a shareable property, for one thing, inhering in particulars. It can also be thought as a class, of which the particulars are now members, instantiations. But it also can be thought of, and most properly is thought of, the argument will unfold along this way, as we've seen already. It must be thought of as the genus that specifies itself. Well, in the judgments of necessity, it specifies itself, but it specifies itself only in as an empirical totality. Here's a bunch of ways in which the genus is. But none of them are necessary to the genus. It's necessary to particularize itself, but it doesn't necessarily have to exhaustively particularize itself in this way. There's nothing necessary, even though the judgments of necessity is what we're talking about. It is not of necessity doing that process. That's what the judgment of concepts are. It's to say genus is what it is by virtue of its specification of itself. So he then also says, this is on 552, this is 552, 55 in the German. It's just after the hyphen. Now, any consideration of the judgment can start either from the originative unity of the concept or from the self-subsistence of the extremes. Everybody see where I'm at? So we could have started with the originary unity, right? Saying we could have started from universality just is particularity, just is singularity. We could have started from that. Or he says we could have started from the self-subsistence of the extremes. That's where we're going to start, because we're starting from the loss of that originative unity. He says judgment is the self-derision, the self-differentiation of the concept. Therefore, it is by starting from the unity of the concept as ground that the judgment is considered in accordance with its true objectivity. In this respect, judgment is the, and he goes back to this, originative division, Teilung in German, of an originative unity. It's the breaking apart of that originary unity, right? It must differentiate itself, and differentiate itself in terms of its own moments. The German word for judgment, Urteil, or primordial division, thus refers to what judgment is in and for itself. So this isn't just, he loves that. He loves the term and writes towards it. It's that the term actually denotes properly what he thinks is at issue here, what's at stake here philosophically. Is that the concept necessarily differentiates itself into these moments. Because it does that, we don't just start from its originary unity, we start from its own differentiation of itself, and then see how that entails its own flow through these various moments, now as distinct. So the judgment forms are thus the structures that articulate the process of particularization. You want to think about it just in straightforward, I don't know how straightforward that is, but bluntly ontological terms. Judgment forms are just the structures that articulate the process of particularization. You can think of them as predication is determination. Predication is determination. That's really what he's trying to lay out here. How does the concept determine itself? Predication is the first way of thinking about that process, and the rule governance of that process. It's the very core of the constitutive movement of the concept. It's the production, we would have said in the objective logic, the manifestation, the causation of what is, actuality as an effect, and the nature of what is as the cause, essence, possible. So the relationship between concept and judgment is this. Concepts are not then, as Kant thought, simply predicates of possible judgments. Kant always told us that that's what a concept is. It's the predicate of a possible judgment, where to be a concept is to be defined by its possible employment in a judgment. Rather, judgment just is the first, most elementary form of the concept, the process that constitutes all that it possesses. Let me back that up. The process that constitutes all that is possesses a structure, law governance, that is articulated, posited, rendered explicit, constituted by, in judgment, and ultimately in syllogistic forms themselves. Now that's all kind of review and preamble, I guess, to what we're looking at in the concept in, the judgment and syllogisms chapter, particularly the judgment chapter. Does that make a little bit of sense? Issues you want to come back to there at that abstract level? That abstract level. So here's the question, I think. for us to go into the judgment chapter with, and just by way of review and see what happens there. How then does judgment precisely as a fixed, stable set of relations? That's what he just told us it is, right? It's the judgment posited as distinct. Sorry, the concept posited as distinct is what the judgment is. How then does judgment, precisely as a fixed or stable set of relations between universality, particularity, and singularity, how does that express or capture the constitutive movement that is the concept? How does that capture it? Look back on 550 one last time. I'll take you to 550. We take a look now at the third paragraph. We've read it. Each one of these paragraphs is what basically happens. Come down now to the third paragraph. It begins, judgment can therefore be called. Let's see where I'm at. He says, judgment can therefore be called the first realization of the concept. For reality denotes in general the entry into existence as determinate being. More precisely, the nature of this realization has presented itself in such a way that the moments of the concept are totalities, which on the one hand subsist on their own through the concept's immanent reflection or through its singularity, the loss, the moment of loss. On the other hand, however, the unity of the concept is their connection. So the self-relations here, it's there in the connection, the linkage, the copulation, the predication. The immanently reflected determinations or determinate totalities that exist just as essentially disconnected, indifferent to each other, as mediated through each other. So, if you ask, what's missing in the concept chapter over against the judgment and syllogism chapter, it's this notion of mediation. Think about it. Look back at the concept. In the concept chapter, if you talked about universality, as I tried to show, there was nothing to say about it, other than its particularization. Just that's what it is. So we shouldn't just go on and start talking about particularization, which is frankly what he does. And then in the particularization chapter, he says, okay, particularization is totality and principle, and we know what that is, and then what is that? Well, it's singularity. There's no mediation going on. There's just flow from one to the next, right? One doesn't negate one, doesn't mediate the other. It just flows from one to the next. But once they become distinct, universality, particularity, and singularity become distinct from one another, then and only then do you have mediation. And the first of the mediations, right, will be the copula. The predication is the initial form of now not just the concept in its distinctness, which is the subject and predicate, but the copula, which is the unity of them being asserted and ultimately being shown through the judgment forms. So he says, just to end that thought off, the determining itself, right, indifferent to each other as mediated through each other. The determining itself is a totality only as containing these totalities and their connections. So the determining, you want to know the process by which the concept determines itself. It's another name for the concept generates everything that it generates. It determines itself. It is self-determining. It's free. Want to know what that means? Great, here you go. The judgment forms tell you precisely that, because he says this totality is the judgment. So judgment, it's got all that. That's what judgment is. You're going to see judgment isn't that more, right? But it's that. Then he says, the latter, judgment, contains therefore the two subsistents which go under the name of subject and predicate. Here's the basic judgment form. So these are self-subsistence. They're universality, particularity, and singularity. That's what's going to fill, as he says, the names for those positions. Right? It's going to go into subject and predicate. What each is cannot yet be said. They are still indeterminate, for they are to be determined only through the judgment. Inasmuch as judgment is the concept as determinate, the only determination is topic 551. At hand is the difference that it contains between determinate and still indeterminate concept. As contrasted to the predicate, the subject can at first be taken, therefore, as the singular over against the universal. So we're going to start off with S is you. Right? S is universal. The subject also as the particular over against the universal, or the singular over against the particular. So far, they stand to each other only as the most determinate and the more universal in general. It is therefore fitting and unavoidable to have these names, subject and predicate. So Hegel's saying, I fully well understand that the judgment forms are ways of forming judgment. I fully understand that it's the rules by which we operate. You want to classify any judgment you have? Here's the categorical table under which all those judgment forms, all those judgments are going to fall. They're going to fall into one of these classifications because that's an exhaustive classification of all judgments. It absolutely is that. But it's not just that. That's his point. Right? It's not just that. We can't take it over and say, well, because it's that, it tells us what the concept is. We have to show it imminently. That's why he's continually saying, this is the concept's doing, not the judger's doing. He's taking away the subjective orientations of judgment forms. He's taking away the subjective orientation, the judger. Notice, there's no judger. I mean, he's about to talk about them, but only to say, well, that's the problem, right? Is we reduce them, we constrict them to being just about what judges are saying, what judges are declaring, what judges are asserting. But the forms are forms on their own. They tell us about the nature of reality, irrespective of the judge's intention. So intention doesn't matter, right? At least at this level, the ontological level, because it's not about the judger, it's about the pure forms themselves. So far, so good. We follow. So the fundamental, this is all by way of review, but I think it's important to review this because of what he's about to do with the final two judgment forms. How that transitions into syllogism. So the fundamental judgment form is the subject, copula, predicate. Tu relata and a link. Subject, predicate, copula, independent. They're specified by the relations between the three determinations, that is, the determinations of the concept, that is, universality, particularity, and singularity. So the subject position at first denotes the space in which the self-subsistent immediate singular appears. So singular is the predicate denotes the space in which the self-subsistent abstract universal first appears. So there's where universality first shows up. It's there. And the copula denotes the space in which the relation of the universal and the individual as particulars first appears. So S-U-P. Singular, universal, particular. And Hegel refers to these positions in the judgment forms, as we just saw, as names, because they designate the places rather than the content. These are positions they're taking. In the form that remain the same as the determinations that occupy them alter. So subject position, predicate position, copula position will have different inhabitants, right? Different moments of the concept will take up those positions. And then he says on 552, and he really discusses this all the way over to 556. I'm not going to belabor this terribly much. I've already talked about this a little bit, but I just want to reinforce it. Hegel spends quite a bit of time here reinforcing it, because he knows, as he will at the beginning of the syllogism chapter as well, as you saw from the day, he knows that, when everybody picks up this logic, they're going to go, okay, let me look at the table of contents and see where the logic is in the logic. And here it is, pretty late, right? The 550 pages in. That's where the logical stuff is, right? Causation is not logical. Quality, quantity, measure, that's not logical. The truly logical stuff is here. So if you just open this up, you would be expecting to talk about the categories of formal logic: concept, judgment, syllogism, classical, Aristotelian logic. And Hegel says very clearly, I'm not talking about that kind of logic. I am talking about that kind of logic, but I'm not just talking about that. So he's always adamant, that's what these pages are here for, to say, I know that these could be rules of thinking, these are rules of judgment, but they're not just that. They're not just that. The way he puts this on 552, I think, is really helpful. So take a look at, this is what he calls the subjective meaning. We mentioned this last week. I just want to go back and reassert this. He says, look on, this is 552 right in the middle. From this subjective standpoint, it's the beginning of the paragraph. This is 55 in the Journal, critical edition. He says, so drop down after this is in the paragraph that begins from the subjective standpoint. So the first, or the second sentence down, the act of judgment accordingly brings. Everybody see where I'm at? The act of judgment. So he's talking about, when a judger makes a judgment. He's talking about the standard way in which, these judgment forms are used. He says, the act of judgment accordingly brings with it the further reflection whether this or that predicate which is in someone's head. So it's all about intention. It's all about what I'm trying to say. It's all about what I'm trying to assert in the judgment. Classical way of understanding this, not his way. Classical way of understanding it. Can and should be attached to the subject matter that exists outside it on its own. So we're trying to predicate things that I have in my head. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, that's round. Oh, that's large. Trying to make judgments called about various things. Should be attached to the subject matter that exists outside it. So the subject's out there, the predicate's in my head, and I've got to get the copula here, by expressing it, the link between the two. The judgment itself is simply the act, subjective act. This is all, as he says at the beginning of this paragraph, from the subjective standpoint. It's the act that combines the predicate with the subject. That's your classic formal logic. So that if this combination did not occur, the subject didn't do, the judger didn't make the judgment. He says, did not occur, the subject and predicate would still each remain what it is. I mean, the table would still be out here, and table in my head wouldn't have been connected, but they're fine. They don't need each other. Subjective judgment in that sense is subjective in the sense of I could do it or I could not do it. It doesn't matter to me. So he says, the subject and predicate would still each remain what it is. The one concretely existing as a thing in itself, thing out in the world, the other as a representation in someone's head. So he calls that the subjective sense, the meaning of the judgment. And then he says, well, that's what words are, using that to make it grammatical. And he says, we could talk about propositions now, Satz, right? And that's what those are. That's when we're making these kind of declarations, is to put words together, try to ascribe things to things that are out in the world, for example. That's a subjective meaning, and that is the sense in which we can talk about it. And in that way, it's a subjective sense. That's not an Urteil. Urteil is the form. Urteil is the form. Well, what's the difference? Well, I'm going to put it very, very bluntly. One of them, the judgment call that we're making about this table is a table, is empirical. And by that I mean it's unnecessary. Right? The table will still be the table, the concept of table in my head will still be the concept of table in my head. They don't need each other. I can predicate all day long, and that's wonderful, great, and I can be right about it, I can be wrong about it. So the correspondence theory of truth can get going from that, all about the judgments about how does it correspond to the state of affairs or not. But Hegel's saying that's not what we're dealing with. That's not the problem of truth that we're dealing with. That's not the problem of judgment that we're dealing with. That's a Satz. That's a proposition. That's not judgment. Judgment forms are talking about necessary relations between moments of the concept. So it's not dependent or predicated upon a subject's making a judgment. This is built into the judgment form itself. So he says, top of page 553, a proposition can indeed have a subject and predicate in a grammatical sense. I'm going to read grammatical as empirical, without, however, being a judgment for that. So just because you can, do subject and predicate grammatically doesn't mean you've got subject and predicate judgment forms, the names for those positions. The latter, judgment, Urteil, requires that the predicate behave with respect to the subject in a relation of conceptual determination. This is why Hegel comes back to this repeatedly, right? What is it about the judgment forms that they're really expressing? Not what the judger is doing in those forms, but what the forms do of themselves. Irrespective of judgers, subjective intent, subjective meaning, any of that concept. Doesn't matter. All that stuff's secondary. It's not an issue. Hence, as a universal with respect to the particular or the singular. And if what is said of a singular subject is itself only something singular, as for instance, Aristotle died at the age of 73 in the 4th year of the 115 Olympiad, then there is a mere proposition. Then this is a mere proposition, not a judgment. Why? Because there's no conceptual determination. It's literally stating facts. The singular is the singular. It's not about the singular is the universal or the universal is the particular. Singular is the particular. None of that. It's just the singular is the singular. He says there would be in it an element of judgment only if one of the circumstances, say the date of death or the age of the philosopher, came into doubt. So now you're talking about, well, is that in fact a singular? That's the doubting. To say, well, does it in fact meet the qualifications, conceptual determination, for being that thing? So what then are we trying to see here? Well, we're obviously not trying to see the subjective meaning, the forms of subjective meaning. We're trying to see what he calls on 554 the objective meaning of the forms in and of themselves. So Hegel is making the quite preposterous, trauma-inducing claim that judgment forms aren't really about us. They're not about our saying things, asserting things, evaluating things about the world, which is, how we think of judgment, let's be honest. But Hegel's going to say, yeah, that's all propositions. Those are all propositions. What we're talking about are judgment forms that are ultimately going to prove out, we haven't gotten there yet, but they're going to prove out to be the nature of reality itself, not the rules by which we think reality, but reality itself. Where do we start, though? We start with an immediate connection between subject and predicate. That's what the judgments of existence really do. They give us that bonding together. He calls this on 552. This is the again. Yeah, take a look on 552. Back up now to the first full paragraph down. Secondly, we now have to examine. Let's see where I'm at. Secondly, we now have to examine more closely how the connection of subject and predicate in judgment is determined, how the two are themselves thereby determined. Judgment has in general totalities for its sides, universality, particularity, singularity, totalities that are at first essentially self-subsistent because of the loss of the concept in the moment of singularity. He then says, the unity of the concept is at first, therefore, only a connection of self-subsistent terms. It is not yet the concrete, and he'll come back to this notion, the fulfilled unity. There's a unity here, it's asserted, right? But it's an immediate unity. That's where we start with the judgments of existence. The fulfilled unity is not yet that has returned into itself from this reality, but is a unity rather outside which the two terms persist, as extremes yet unsublated in it. So where do we begin? Just the connection, bare predication. Where do we end up? We end up by showing that bare predication, bare binding together of the subject to the predicate, the immediate assertion that the subject is the predicate, that judgment form. We don't care about the judger's standpoint here. It doesn't matter what they intended, what they're trying to say, what they mean. Put all that aside, just what the judgment form itself does in terms of conceptual determination is that the singular just is the universal, it's just asserting that. But the is there, the copula, is immediate. It's immediate. It doesn't go beyond, you can hear immediate as just mere assertion that the two belong together. Now, if you think about what we did last week, and let me bring this up so we can at least have this. Again, we used a little last week. And I haven't revised this, but this will work good enough for what we're trying to do. So here's the table of judgments I gave you last week. So what we see here is, Hegel taking us through the four judgment forms, right? And the judgments of existence, the judgment of reflection, necessity, and concept. And what I tried to show last week, I'm not going back through and do this in detail, obviously, but what I tried to show last week is what that issue in all of them is, how do we conceptually determine, how is better, not how we, but how is universality conceptually determined in each one? The first judgment form says universality is a shared property. So when you say something is predicate universality of something, you're saying, oh, that universality inheres in that thing. It belongs to that thing. That's all it's saying. Universality is not something unto itself. Universality is something that is born within, inheres within, is shared by particulars. So that's what the positive, negative, and infinite forms of judgment at the end of the day really assert. But that leads then to say, well, wait a minute, how do they all get this sharing going on? How can they all share? This is the basic philosophical insight. How can they all share if they're not all members of the same class? Right? It's not just that, that's got the same colors, that's got the same colors, that's got the same color. My God, these things all have the same color. What's the sameness of that color? But the sameness of that color is their class. They're all members, in some form, fashion, or other, of that class. Well, that's a reflective judgment now, not an existence judgment. You're now not just saying, hey, look, these things all have this universality, this property that they all share in common. You're saying that property is actually something unto itself. But that universality subsumes them under itself. So the judgments of reflection are about subsumption. Now, he also calls these the difference between the quality judgments and the quantitative judgments. The qualitative judgment form and the quantitative judgment form. If you think about that for a moment, the qualitative judgment form makes a lot of sense, right? You're talking about, well, this is universality thought as a quality of things, right? As a feature of things themselves. There is no table outside all the tables that we see in the world. There's no concept table, right? There's no universality, to use that example. Outside of all the tables, I used the rose example last week, but there is nothing, beyond the various tables that exist that we call tableness itself. But then, so that'd be the judgments of existence. But he says, but how do they all have the same thing, same feature? How can they all be, tables? Here's your nominalism to Platonic realism moment, right? How we get from everything's got this feature, then the feature must be something unto itself. Standard Plato 101, right? Early dialogues. Socrates is going, well, if these things have this thing and that thing has this thing, then they all belong to this one thing called the concept thereof. And I'd like for you to give me the logos of that, right? Which you're terrible at doing because you give me examples. I want to know the definition of the thing itself. Well, that's already to move up to an abstracted form of universality, where now we're talking about universality as a class, a form, if you want to put it in the Platonic language, where that actually has to be thought of as all these various particulars the form doesn't inherit in them. They're all members of it, instantiations of it. Sort of rudimentary, classic Platonism, Plato, but it's Platonism. But that means that you've got to then ask the reverse question. So that's the judgments of reflection, right? But then you've got to ask the reverse question, well, how do they all get to be instantiations of the concept, of the universal? How did they get to all be particularizations as individuals of the universal? That's what the individual, particular, universal judgment forms are really talking about, the judgments of reflection. How does that work? How can they be subsumed? Well, the only way they can be subsumed is if they genuinely express the universal in some way. They don't just happenstance go in it. They have to be actual specifications of the universal. Well, here we move from the judgment form of reflection to that of necessity. Now, as you heard me say last week, the judgment form of necessity is probably ill-named, right? Because Hegel's point about all the judgment forms of necessity, whether we're talking about the categorical, the hypothetical, or the disjunctive judgment form, is at the end of the day, what you've got there is a way of thinking about universality that is a genus that specifies itself. That's what's true about all three of those judgment forms. The judgment of necessity is about that. But what's not true, this is what the misnaming is about, is that it's necessitated. So even if you look at the judgment form of necessity, the disjunctive judgment form of necessity, A is either B or C or D or E or that whole litany of things. Those are specifications of the universal, right? So that's particularization of the universal. We're going to put it in those terms, and that's the way Hegel thinks about it. So each one of those is individuality. So you say, we're back, right? We're back to the concept and how it works, how it flows. And you are and you aren't. You are in the sense that now we're not thinking about universality as a class that has members, instantiation. And you're not thinking about it as universality as something that inheres in a bunch of particulars. But you're actually thinking about universality as what particularizes itself, the genus that specifies itself is the genus, is the universal that particularizes itself in individuality. Great, wonderful. But what you don't have is necessity. So what the logical operators do in the categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive judgments, particularly the if, then, and either, or, those logical operators that are introduced there, that's really trying to say, now we've got to think about how this universal determines itself. That's the meaning, the objective meaning of those logical operators. But when you say, stay with my example I used last week, the rose, right, is either dog or Gaelic or red leaf or Cherokee or chestnut, all these varieties of roses. You're just giving the proliferation of roses, right? What rose is in its proliferating condition. So it looks like you're giving a totality, to go back to the concept discussion of particularity. It looks like you're giving a totality. You might even be able to give an exhaustive totality. But what you don't have there is a principle of determination. You have a bunch of determinations. You might even claim you have, but how could you claim this? But you might even want to claim, oh, it's an exhaustive determination. So the either or is exhaustive. But Hegel wants to say, no, nothing into the either or in and of itself. There's no magic there that gives you the modality. That is what's missing. All you have is universality particularizes itself in the individuality, and here's the way it's done so. As I said last week, that could have been in response to any number of different principles. The principle example I gave last week was consumer preference. Customers want more different kinds of varieties of roses. That's why we get more different kinds of roses. That's what the proliferation is coming from. So it's an empirical specification, an empirical particularization. And in that sense, it's an empirical totality. It's not an exhaustive totality. It's not a true totality. It's not a true, complete particularization. So on Hegel's account, you might want to say a particular species is an individual of rose. Right? But Hegel will say, actually, no, it's not. Unless you can give the principle by which it necessarily had to give rise to that, then that's not an individual. That's a particular. It's a this particular. That's the best it can be. It's not an individual. It's not complete. Because there is no modal necessity for why that specification took place. If the modal specification is consumer preference, I'm using that as a simple example, then you've got an empirical totality that's bound together by something that's external to it, not something that emanated from within. That makes sense? That's where we ended class last time. So here's the move then to the apodictic, the judgment concept. Here, we now have necessity at its very core. That's what it's really all about. So whether we're talking about the assertoric, which is just declarative now, but it's problematic. The possibility language comes in. The rose is possibly beautiful or good. Then finally, the apodictic. The rose is necessarily beautiful. Necessarily. Well, that last little bit of necessity, that modality, which is missing paradoxically from the judgment of necessity, is what makes now the genus determination of the universal more than just a specification into a empirical totality. It makes that specification into a complete and exhaustive totality because it's the principle. There's a necessity to the determination. Now, does that make a little bit of sense? You okay with that? All that's by way of review. Nothing of that terribly new, but I did want to run through that just to kind of remind us of the train of analysis, the train of argumentation. Hegel's laid out. Make some sense? So that's what I'm trying to capture up here with both this chart, which is tries to really lay out the various kinds of relation and the various kinds of forms of universality. What I'm trying to say with the difference between the genus and the concrete universality, specification and determination, is this notion of the modality. Right? The determination is really ultimately what you get when you have necessary modality. But the modality is necessity itself. We good? Questions, issues, problems about that? Now, take a look with me on page 588. So, this is the first page of the Syllogism chapter. I alluded to stuff from this this section of the discussion last week. I read something from it. I'm going to come back to it obviously now and work on it more carefully. But Hegel makes some assertions here that I think we need to ask, where did you show that? Because you're saying you did, but where and how did you show this? So look at where he begins off. Just straight the very first lines on 588, first paragraph. The syllogism is itself the restoration. It's a loaded term, right? The coming back to itself, right? There is this notion of self-reflective, self-relation. So the syllogism is now not the loss of the concept, but the concept come back to itself after it's been posited in its distinct form. Now it's come back to itself. So that moment of in singularity where it lost, it's both the loss of the concept and the self-relation of the concept. The judgment corresponds roughly to let's grapple with the distinctiveness, the loss of the concept, the self-subsistence of the moment, and then we see, oh wait a minute, they actually do come back to themselves in one moment, but they come back to themselves in a different form because they come back to themselves as distinct now. So universality doesn't just flow into particularity, it just flows into individuality. Now universality is a thing unto itself that generates its own particularization, that generates individuality out of that. So I think one thing you can say is, check me if I'm wrong about this, but if you look at the concept chapter, the focus there, right, the real, I always apologize to the vegetarians and vegans for this, the real meat of that chapter is in the particularity discussion. Right? That's where you get this, stuff about totality, and where you get the stuff about principle, and that seems to be the heart and soul of what's really going on there. But what you realize in the judgment chapter is that, wait a minute, this is really fundamentally about universality. That all that stuff is wonderful and good about particularity and particularization, it's a process in the concept chapter, but that means we've got to think universality differently than as a shared property, a class. It must be thought of as a genus that specifies itself necessarily. So that's why he says the syllogism is itself the restoration, the bringing back to itself, the remaking of itself, of the concept in the judgment, and consequently has the unity and the truth of both. So there's that language of it's the truth of both the concept and the judgment. The concept as such holds its moments sublated in this unity. In judgment, this unity is internal, or what amounts to the same external. It doesn't really matter, we're talking about the judgment form, so it just is how this works. And although the moments are connected, they are posited as self-subsisting extremes. So there's his, kind of brief clip note version of what's going on in the judgment chapter. He's going to say more about it. Let's at least take that. He then says, here's what's going to go on in the syllogism chapter. In the syllogism, the determinations of the concept are like the extremes of the judgment, and at the same time, their determinate unity is positive. So the judgment forms are about the extremes being positive, and the copula is important, but secondary until the last moment, as we see in a second. The syllogism is all about all those moments. It's about the extremes and the unity itself. It's about how that's produced. He then says, famously, I quoted this last week, this is on still 588, and this is right down in the next paragraph down. Thus, the syllogism is a completely positive concept. It is therefore the rational. So he knows how that's going to be heard, how it's going to be read. Oh, yeah. Okay, we got you. It's the rational means it's how we think. So immediately look at what he does. Every time it looks like it's going to turn subjective, Hegel backs off of it, says this. Here's what he says here. The understanding is taken to be the faculty of the determinate concept. So he's already saying, okay, I get what you're going to do with this. You're going to think about it in terms of rationalization, in terms of what the understanding does, fixes on these distinctions, and that's what it does. So that's, now we're talking about the syllogisms of how you really ought to think. What's this? The understanding is taken to be the faculty of the determinate concept, which is held fixed for itself by virtue of abstraction in the form of universality. But in reason, the determinate concepts are positive in their totality and unity. That could have been written by Kant. Right? So he's just reporting to you, what traditional logic would say, yeah, the understanding gets fixated on the distinctions in the judgment forms, and what really it should be doing is progressing on to what reason is about. Right? And reason is about what? It's about syllogism. But look what he says. But in reason, the determinate concepts are posited in their totality and unity. Therefore, it is not just that the syllogism is rational, but that everything rational is a syllogism. Now, the import of that at this moment might sound like, oh, insofar as you're reasoning about things, you should reason syllogistically. And, that's true, but that's not Hegel, right? Hegel's not telling that. Wolff would tell you, right? Anybody who is a proponent of classical, Aristotelian-derived, medieval, reshaped, and inflected logic would say true reasoning is always ultimately syllogistic. So Hegel's not saying anything extraordinary there, except for what he means by everything rational is a syllogism is he doesn't mean all of your reasoning about things is syllogistic. He means what he said. Everything is a syllogism. This table is a syllogism. This room is a syllogism. This world is syllogistic at its very core. Not just how we think about it, which is secondarily true. If you want to, get to the depth of what's going on in reality, yeah, you ought to think syllogistically. But that's not because that's a really great way to reason. It's because that's the way the world is set up. The world is in itself syllogistic. Well, that's nuts. Everything rational is a syllogism. Everything that exists is a syllogism. He says again, leave it at that. He says everything is rational is a syllogism. So Hegel's central claim is that the syllogism, and the syllogistic forms more precisely, is nothing other than the restoration of the concept of judgment. And what that means is that the inner or extrinsic unity that binds together the fixed determinations, the self-streams, of the concept, universality, particularity, singularity, which are explicitly posited as distinct from one another in the judgment forms, are rendered at once here determinate and explicit in the syllogistic form. So that's the betterment of it. The syllogism is thus both the positive, explicit, determinate unity and the positive, explicit, determinate streams of the concept, which is to say is the articulation of the generative process that is the concept in its full determinate structure. So remember, we went to formal logic not just because it's fun, not because we want to get, finally on a science of logic, get to the logic of the matter, but because we want to understand the rule governance of the generative process by which all things are what they are and are at all. Hegel's claim is that's what the concept, judgment, and syllogism gives us. So everything rational in syllogism means that everything that exists is syllogistic in its form, because Hegel thinks that the totality of what is amenable to thought, is equal to thought. It can't be thought, can be grasped and understood. And that grasping and understanding of it is precisely to understand it in its syllogistic structure, because that's what the fundamental generative process of everything is. Yeah. That's the claim on offer, which is, again, crazy. But how was that possibly proved? How did the judgment entail that? How do judgment forms entail? Well, the judgment forms are about subject and predicate, and about the linkage between the two of them, yes. The last two judgment forms, the judgment form, the disjunctive judgment form of the judgment of necessity, and the last of the three judgment forms of the judgment of the concept, the disjunctive judgment form and the apodictic judgment form. Think about those for just a moment. So what the disjunctive judgment form says is that the concrete objective universal determines or particularizes itself as particular and thus as singularity. That's what the disjunctive either or logical operator does. So it says universality is concrete or objective. It's not an inherent, it's not a class concept. It is actually generating itself out of itself, particularizing. And the apodictic judgment form says, concrete objective universality specifies or determines itself necessarily. There's the modal kicker that we didn't have in the judgment of necessity. As particularity, thus as singularity. So it's the modality as necessity. That's the judgment of the concept. Now you can say then that, well, here, the copula, which we don't have an is predication right here, at least not in the disjunctive, the disjunctive judgment. We have it here in the form of the logical operator either or. But that's still the copula, right? That's still the way that's still the copula function in these judgments. So the copula is disjunctive, we could say, and apodictic. Precisely when it's not the immediate identification that defines the judgment forms of existence, the immediate inherence of the universal in the singular, or reflection, that is the subsumption of the singular into the universal. But why in the world do disjunctive and apodictic forms of judgment necessarily entail syllogisms? We all know it's the next thing, right? If you look up in a logic book, it's going to be after the judgment forms, what comes next? The syllogisms, welcome, and now we'll have a lesson on syllogistic forms. But that's not an organization that's necessitated. That's just the way the textbooks organize the discussion, because it's prudential, right? It's wise to do it that way. Because what are you dealing with? You're dealing with concepts first, put concepts together in judgment, and put judgments together in syllogisms. Additive and building, and that makes a lot of sense. But Hegel's saying, right, if you just accept it like that, which Kant did, if you accept it like that, then where are you going to end up? You're not going to be able to actually show why judgment forms entail syllogisms. So we've shown why concepts entail judgments, because the completion of individuality entails the originary separation of subject and predicate, universality, particularity, singularity. So there's where you get judgment forms. But why do judgment forms entail syllogism? Go to the apodictic. Does the question make sense, right? Why is that? Why that transition from judgment form to syllogism? Look at the apodictic form of judgment, the very last judgment. Apodictic form of judgment. Apodictic judgment, like its other neighbors in the judgment of the concept, like the assertoric and the problematic judgment forms from which it derives, it operates with the concrete objective universal. So we're not talking about a class concept anymore. We're not talking about an inherence model of universality. That is objective universality, universality that unites or includes particularity and universality within one another. It is the universal that is nothing other than the particularization of itself as singular. That's what it's doing. That's what the apodictic is doing. All three judgments of the concept, the assertoric and the problematic and the apodictic, predicate concrete universality of the singular. So the assertoric form, the X is Y, makes this connection between concrete universality and the singular immediately, providing no ground for the singular to fit into this unity. As a result, the individual in the assertoric judgment form may or may not fit, depending upon what particularity it possesses. So notice the status of particularity is what's at issue. Right? Why this particularization? The problematic judgment form renders that uncertain status of the singular, it may or may not fit, renders it explicit with respect to the universal. It could fit, it possibly fits. Who knows if it does necessarily fit. And then the apodictic judgment form specifies that the singular must necessarily belong to the universal because the singular possesses or is determined by the appropriate particularity. So until that last moment of apodicticity, right, the apodictic moment, you don't have this, oh, wait a minute, what's doing the work here is universality particularizing itself necessarily. So simply put, the apodictic judgment is the transformation of the copula from being defined by the process of particularization as an unprincipled exhaustion in empirical totality to an eminently necessary particularization. Here you have principled exhaustion, you have totality in the sense in which we saw it in the concept, in the particularization concept. This is because the very nature of the universal in the predicate position is determined as, that is specified as, nothing other than the particularity of the singular in the subject position. That's what the apodictic judgment does. The singular contains what it ought to be, what is its constitution, its ground, and this norm or constitution ground is predicated as being nothing other than the concrete objective universal, the predicate, and thus the predication in apodictic judgment is a matter wholly of determinate correspondence between the singular subject and the universal predicate. So the house, the singular house, constituted as so-and-so, particular, is good, is universal. It's a singularized universal, an objective universal. The action, constituted as so-and-so, particularized in a certain way, is right, but only is constituted in that way, only is particularized in that way, is it right? Again, a singularized universal, objective universal. But for the copula to be disjunctive and apodictic precisely in this way, so it's disjunctive in the sense that it distinguishes itself, differentiates itself, and it's apodictic in that it does that necessarily. Wherein particularity is equally and immediately determining of the singular and the universal. Catch that again. Particularity is equally and immediately determining of the singular, it's what the singular is, and it's what the universal is. By virtue of that, and of that alone, do they fit with one another, the singular and the universal. That means that both the subject and the predicate positions are actually each themselves judgments. Now this is the key claim. Hegel's arguing that this S is P has buried within it two other S's relating to one to P, the other universality. So in the subject, the singular is really being said to be the particular. It is a certain kind of way. That's what you mean when you say the house is constituted as so-and-so. It's got this particularity. So you're saying the S is the particular. S is P. And then in the predicate, you're saying, oh, the universal is the particular. So they can meet up. They can fit to one another. So here's what the house has. Here's what it is to be a good dwelling. They meet up around particularity. That's where they join together with one another. But you don't get that apodictic assertion. You don't get that. You don't get that apodictic judgment form unless you have the subject already has this judgment in it of S is P. Here, S is this house is a particular kind of setup, a particular kind of construction, and the predicate has already got this universality that's been specified in a certain sort of way. So both of those positions, the subject and the predicate position, actually bear within themselves judgments. So Hegel's claim is that the apodictic judgment form contains within it, necessarily for it to do what it does, a syllogism. It's already itself syllogistic because it's a relating of judgments to one another. What connects the singular in the subject with the universal in the predicate is thus no longer simply the identity expressed by the copula, which if you go back to the first judgment form, that's all there is, just is, bare predication, just that. But for it to have apodicticity, absolute necessity, could not be any other way, then the subject and the predicate have to themselves have judgments going on within each one of them. So it's no longer the simple identity expressed by the copula, but the particularity that both positions contain. So where do they meet? Particularity. Why? Because universality must be particularized in a certain way, and the singular must have those particular features. S is P, now singular is particular. Universal is particular is what the predicate says. You've got two judgments, not one. What's the conclusion of these two judgments? S is P. The house is good. But it's because the house has so-and-so features, particular features. And good is specified in a particular way that those meet with one another. In other words, there's a buried within that bare-looking assertion, the house is good, are two more fundamental judgments that have that as their conclusion. So rather, predication has shown itself to be here a process in which an immediate relation between singularity and particularity, on the subject side, is joined with an immediate relation between particularity and universality in the predicate side. Singularity and universality are thus shown by the judgment forms themselves to be necessarily related as determinations of the concept through the process of particularization, where this process concludes universality from singularity by means of particularity. But notice, it concludes it, it infers it by virtue of that. That's not a judgment form anymore. That's not an SSP. The copula of predication, that's not what's going on here. Now we've got inference. Inference is what syllogisms do. They infer conclusions from the major and minor premise. So singularity and universality are thus shown by the judgment form to be necessarily related as determinations of the concept through the process of particularization, where this process concludes or infers universality from singularity by means of or through particularity. The inference of universality, that's the major term. From singularity, that's the minor term. By way of particularity, that's the middle term. You have in that singular, particular, universal, that's the basic form that he starts with that every syllogism is derived from. So the copula is predication and judgment has therefore, via the disjunctive and apodictic judgment forms themselves, proven to be, as its result and thus its truth, nothing other than the inferential process of from one extreme to the other by way of the middle. That's Hegel's favorite definition of a syllogism. From one extreme to the other, from the major to the minor, from the minor to the major, by way of what? The middle. So Hegel's saying that judgment forms already show us that their truth is predicated, that predication is built upon the truth of inference. Retrogressive grounding. So predication is just inference. That's the argument he's now gotten this. That predication is inference. It looks like it's just bare assertion. It's the linking of the subject to the predicate, and that's all it is. But when you look at it and let it develop on its own, and it goes through all these permutations, what you're ultimately driven to see is that the predication is really not just predication. That you don't get the is of the apodictic judgment without, prior to that, the subject determination has some bit of predication already going on within it, and the predicate determination has some predication going on within it, and then those two are related inferentially to derive the essence P of the apodictic judgment as its conclusion. And what's the key to that? Notice the disjunctive judgment tells you that the genus has to specify itself, so they meet through particularization. So they go from one extreme to the other. They go from the major extreme of universality to the minor extreme of singularity by way of the middle. particularization. There's the basic judgment form. So predication, at the end of the day, the truth of predication turns out to be inferential. Now, if you want to, does that make some sense? It's crazy, but I think it's merited. It's there. Right? Hegel's asking the question, how is, it's bluntly put, how is this apodictic judgment form different than that first positive form? This X is Y. What's the difference in the is? Right? Those two judgment forms. What's happened? Right? That is now, the copula is now somehow or another got this necessity attached to it that it didn't have in the first one. Right? In the first one, it didn't have anything like this. It was just simply saying, well, this is inheres, universality inheres in singularity. That's all that's going on. How did we get from that bare predication to something that has necessity built into it? Well, one thing that happened was we realized, right, the judgment forms tell us that universality has to be specifying of itself. That's what the judgments of necessity tell us. In particular, the disjunctive judgment, the either or, tells us that universality either is this or this or this or this. That's its specification. But that didn't give us necessity. So where do we get the necessity from? We get the necessity in the apodictic judgment. How do we get that? Because the subject position and the predicate position are both themselves judgments that lead to, through inference, lead to that apodictic conclusion. That's the only way you get that. The subject is, in the subject position you get singular is particular, and in the predicate position you get universality is particularization. And because particularization of the universal and particularization of the singular is the same damn thing, it's the middle, then you can pass from one extreme, the major extreme, universality, to the minor extreme, singularity, through the middle. That's no longer a judgment form. That's not the copula. That's not subject is predicate. That's the syllogistic. So that's why he says that argument, which is on page 586 to 587. I'm summarizing what he's laying out. So look at where he says this. Take a look on 586. This is the second full paragraph down. The paragraph begins, the transition from the immediate simplicity of the fact to the correspondence. If I see where I'm at there. So drop down about halfway into that paragraph. The judgment, therefore, has its ground in. Let's see where I'm at. So the judgment, therefore, he's talking about the apodictic judgment. Right? That's the judgment form he's last out. But he's going to draw this out more broadly. Therefore, has its ground in the constitution of the subject and thereby apodicted. Consequently, we now have the determined and accomplished, right, fulfilled, erfüllte, right, fulfilled, completed, right, copula, which hitherto consisted in the abstract is. That's what we started with. The abstract is just predication unto itself. But has now further developed into ground in general. It first attaches to the subject as immediate determinants, but it is equally the connection to the predicate. A predicate that is no longer, that has no other content than the correspondence itself, or the connection of the subject to universality. Thus, the form of judgment has passed away. What happened to it? We were just using it. We're saying it's now got fulfilled, right? It's now good. It's now doing what judgment form is supposed to do. The is working, right? The predication is all complete. Why? He says, first, because the subject and predicate are in themselves the same content. The subject and the predicate are themselves the same content. They really are about they are about particularization. Right? That's what both of them are about. The singular is the house is particularly like this. It's good because it's like this. In themselves the same content. But secondly, because through its determinateness, the subject points beyond itself and connects itself to the predicate. But again, third, this connecting has equally passed over into the predicate, only constitutes the content of it, and so it is the connecting as posited of the judgment itself. The concrete identity of the concept that with the result of the disjunctive judgment and constitutes the inner foundation of the judgment of the concept, the identity that was posited at first only in the predicate is thus recovered in the whole. So there's the subject's got a judgment in it, predicate's got a judgment in it. That's what leads to the conclusion itself. Look at the top of 587. On closer examination, the positive factor in this result, which is responsible for the transition of the judgment into another form, syllogism, is that, as we have just seen, the subject and predicate are, in the apodictic judgment, each of the whole concept. The unity of the concept, as the determinants constituting the copula that connects them, is at the same time distinct from them. At first, it stands only on the other side of the subject as the latter's immediate constitution. So it's over there. We got to get over there. But now we realize it's got to be in both, and that's why the judgment forms come to bear on both the subject side and the predicate side. But since its essence is to connect, it is not only that immediate constitution, but the universal that runs through the subject and predicate. The universal that runs through. It used to just stand on one side or the other, right? It was either going to collapse, the universal is either going to collapse back into the singular, it's one of its features, or it's going to be the class that assumes everything under it, but then everything's going into it. But now it runs through both sides. While subject and predicate have the same content, it is the form of their connection that is instead posited through the determinants of the copula. The determinants has the universal or the particularity. Thus, it contains in itself both the form determinations of the extremes and is the determinate connection of the subject and predicate, the accomplished, right, this is that same language, erfüllte, accomplished, complete, copula of the judgment, the copula replete with content, full of content. Literally, the language here is evocative of pregnancy, right? It's pregnant with this content. It's got all of that. That's in the copula. The unity of the concept that reemerges from the judgment wherein it was lost. There's that reference all the way back to it's lost in the extremes, right? So it's lost in singularity into the moments of abstraction. By virtue of this repletion, Erfüllung, he's playing on this term, completion, generates itself from this. By virtue of this repletion of the copula, the judgment has become syllogism. So that's why he could say already the judgment form itself, the apodictic judgment form, in order to be what it is, in order to get the necessity, the modality of necessity in the copula, can't just be a copula. It's got to be inferential. And because it's got to be inferential, it's already the syllogism. So I would submit now that, perhaps that begins to tell us why he starts off on 588 with that line that we read a few minutes ago. The syllogism is the result of the restoration of the concept in the judgment. Right? Not despite the judgment, not over against the judgment, not, we've got the concept over here and those judgments, finally we've got those judgment forms, they have fallen away, so we don't need them anymore. We've abandoned them. No. We restore, the concept comes back to itself. The story of the judgment chapter is loss and recovery. And what's lost, we begin with the loss of the unity of the concept in its three moments, lost in the self-subsistence of each one. What the judgment forms ultimately tell us, teach us, show us, demonstrate to us, is that actually universality particularizes itself into individuality, and those are three distinct moments, yes, but they're three distinct moments that have to be thought in relation to one another, in necessary relation. So the restoring of that, the restoration of the concept, is the coming back to, well, one entails the next, one necessitates the next. Universality entails particularization, particularization entails individuality. But what we didn't have in the concept chapter, that we do have now, is each one of them stand distinct and entail the next one by virtue of what they are. So as I said just a moment ago, I think this is right, that there's a subtle shift going on from the weight of everything being around particularization. We really won't lose that centrality of particularization, but we will see that it's got to be thought in universality itself. That universality has to be thought of as nothing other than particularization itself, because that's its determination. So give me just another moment to set up what we're going to do with the syllogisms, and then we'll be on into the syllogisms themselves. Questions about what I just did? And that's kind of hairy and strange and weird, right? But I think there is an insight there. I think there's a brilliant insight here, that the only way you get this judgment, the apodictic judgment, is the X is necessarily the Y, is to say, well, undergirding that, underlying that, born within it, right? He talks about it being replete with content, the stuff that's already in it. What's already buried within it is the X already has to be, so the X is singular, the X has to be, the singular is particularity already. And the Y, for the necessity of that modal relationship to be there, that relation to be there, the Y, which is universality, has to be particularized in a certain way so that they fit together. But that means the one extreme is being linked to the other extreme through the middle, not through the is of predication. It's an inferential result. That's an inference, in other words. That's a conclusion to an argument, to put it in another language. That's not just an assertion, like we started off with. So we move from the bare is to the is that is the is of syllogistic logic, which is inferential, through where the major and minor terms are linked through the middle. which is already taking place in the apodictic form. Questions, issues about that? Remember, Hegel's point has always been that formal logic is fine unto itself. He calls it at one point, and this is in the preface to the subjective logic, he says, it's like a bunch of dead, dry bones. It's dead unto itself. And what we need to do is see how it's alive. What that means for him is how one form entails the next. Well, this is him arguing that concepts entail judgments and judgments entail syllogism. This is what he's trying to show. This is what he thinks is not going on in Kant or Fichte or anybody else that takes up standard received inheritance of logic and just simply takes it over without demonstrating, establishing its claims for what it's trying to do. We now talk just very briefly because it's here really already on the page. It's worth mentioning, so let me do that, and then we'll come back and talk about the syllogistic forms. So we saw those two lines on 588, where he says the syllogism is a completely positive concept, it is therefore the rational. All content can be rational only through the rational form. Everything that is rational is syllogistic, syllogism. And we said that wasn't just the way we reason about things, it's the nature of reality itself. Well, at that point, it's worth thinking about more broadly, I think, just a moment, his claim here, which is that to be what we examined ultimately in the objective logic. So we ended with the concept of actuality, for anything to be at all, and for it to be what it is, its essence. He claimed there is to be, what he's saying, is to be generated by virtue of syllogistic logic. That's his claim. Now, we haven't seen him demonstrate that, lay that out, but we can already say, well, if the concept is the truth of essence and essence is the truth of being, just follow with that. Then if the concept is syllogism, then everything that is, insofar as it is what it is, so both being and essence, it is what it is by virtue of syllogism. So you could say that, as Hegel does say, that what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. This is what he famously says in the preface to the philosophy of right. It's called the Doppelsatz, right? This is the famous claim where he says, what is rational, that is actual, what is actual, that is rational. And people run off and go, see, there you go. Anything that exists is rational. And that's all that rationality is everything that exists. So whatever happens to be the status quo, this is the quietism reading of Hegel's political philosophy, it comes straight out of this, is what you see there is his admission. Right? This is in the context of Hegel saying, I'm not here like Plato to write the Republic and give you a project, an ideal for what an ideal city will be like. So this is often thought of to be Hegel's realism in the sense of his pragmatic realism. Just conceding, here's the nature of reality, it's rational, whatever is what's rational. But I would hope that this far into the logic, we wouldn't trust that reading. We know that actuality has a pretty robust definition that's not just whatever happens to be around. Hegel says at one point, trying to respond to the criticisms of that line, I didn't mean by that existence. I said actuality because I'm in actuality. I wrote a big book about this where it talked about actuality. Why don't you reference that? He did. Got no sense though, because that's what it says. He says it has, the term he used for it there is, has an emphatic sense. Actuality has an emphatic sense. What that means is it has a technical sense, a logical sense. And what does that mean? It means that everything is in thoroughgoing reciprocal determination with one another. Everything's in thoroughgoing reciprocity. Everything's in thoroughgoing relation with one another. And it has the modality of necessity and contingency. That's what it's got. That's what we mean by saying everything that is actual. And now he's saying, oh, everything that's actual is rational. Well, again, that has an emphatic sense, right? It doesn't just mean, oh, things are as they ought to be. It doesn't mean that. It's an assertion, it's an ontological assertion. He's saying there's an actuality, and that actuality has and is rational. And what it means for it to be rational is it's syllogistic. So when Hegel makes crazy claims in the philosophy of right, but also everywhere else in his philosophy, where he says, you know what this is? This is a syllogism. He doesn't mean, you know how you can think of that? You can think of it like a syllogism. It's not analogical. Right? Hegel is an identitarian when it comes to this stuff. He's saying these things aren't like a syllogism, they are a syllogism, right? Because syllogisms aren't just the way we think, it's the nature of reality itself. So actuality, then, we can say, is the process of manifestation, wherein both essence and being are constituted as moments. And actuality, precisely as that process of manifestation, shows itself, it has shown itself, this is the argument of objective logic, to be the movement of the concept, whose endemic logic is more fully articulated by the structure of the syllogism, the rational form. The rational in the actual is not, then, an empty abstraction from the finite, whether abstract universality or abstract singularity or abstract particularity. Rather, the rational in the actual is, as Hegel notes, it's 589, 9 lines down from the top, where he talks about the notion of fulfilled universality. So, just after the hyphen, the answer is that the infinitude in them is not the empty abstraction from the finite. Is not a universality which is void of content and determination, but is the fulfilled universality. Fulfilled universality is the same thing as concrete universality. Objective universality means all the same thing for you. The concept which is determined and is truly in possession of its determinants, namely in that it differentiates itself internally. It doesn't have differentiation take place to it, or happen to it, or affect it. It does it to itself. And is the unity of its thus intelligible and determined differences. Only in this way does reason rise above the finite, the conditioned, the sensuous, or however one might define it, and is in this negativity essentially replete with content. There's that line again there. This bears content within itself. For as unity, it is the unity. It is the unity of determined extremes, and so the rational is nothing but the syllogism. So the way to read that line, the rational is the actual and the actual is the rational, is to say, Hegel thinks that because he knows what actuality is. He's arguing about what actuality is, the process of manifestation. And his claim is that it's rational because it has a rational structure to the generative process by which actuality has been constituted. And that structure is a syllogism. So when Hegel says, as he does, one of the most important points in the philosophy of right, he says, we're going to talk now about what he calls the political state. That is the form of government. And the proper form of government, its constitution as he calls it, not the written constitution, but its structure, how it's put together, he says, has a moment of universality, particularity, and individuality. You know how they relate to one another? Glad you asked syllogistic. Not because that's a nice way to think, but because that's the truth of the matter. That's what true states are. That's what true governments are. That's not how best to think about them. So he's not giving you a plan for how to think about the future or how we might build, an ideal society, utopia. So it's not the republic. At least the first half of the republic. Remember the second half of the republic, everything goes to hell. But first half of the republic, before the city starts moving. So he's saying, I'm not trying to give you that blueprint for, the ideal utopic society. What I am trying to give you is the truth of these things, what they are fundamentally. So that's not a pragmatic realism. That's an ontological claim. So let me leave it there. We'll come back and take a look at the syllogistic forms and how they work through inherence, subsumption, and determination as well. We'll go back to those within well. We'll come back. So take a break. We're at 4:39. We'll come back about 4:49, and we'll move on from there. Thank you.